Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange. Today I'm here to do another science fiction and fantasy wrap-up, and if you've been following my updates over the last few weeks, you might be aware that I pretty much locked in what my favorite science fiction fantasy books are for 2022, both in terms of backlist and now in terms of front list. And so I had this weird, dumb idea in my head to purposely seek out underhyped books and books with lower ratings so that hopefully I wouldn't accidentally stumble upon a favorite and regret having filmed my best of the year videos already. That was a terrible idea. Next year I'm going to do it differently because I basically got myself into an end of the year reading slump, which is a horrible place to be, especially for a YouTube creator that literally makes all their content around reading and recommending good books. And so I have some books to talk about here, but before we get started, I know a lot of people aren't interested in reading slump updates, so I will say that I've been fighting against the slump, and despite feeling kind of not so excited about some books, I've actually found some books that really did work for me despite my slumpy mood. So I do have some books to recommend. This isn't a total wash of a video before you click away. All that being said, let's get started. First, starting with science fiction, which I'll be honest is a little bit more sparse than usual, which maybe contributed to my reading slump, but I read Slaughterhouse-Five by Vonnegut, and this is a piece of literary science fiction that follows a man who potentially is time traveling within the story, and this book is largely described as an anti-war story, or a story that really criticizes war efforts, and it's one that I've wanted to read for a really long time. I've been slowly working my way through the classics of the genre, and at least in my interpretation, this is my first time reading it, it did read as more literary than science fiction. There is time travel elements within the story, but I took them to be, again, more literary than actually happening. I would be interested to know for those that have read this book if that interpretation is correct. But I did enjoy the story. It's very character focused, it's very slow paced, it's set in a period of time that I don't personally have a strong connection to. I'll be honest, the beginning of this book started out pretty slow for me, but around the second half I really did find myself clicking with the book. I enjoyed the social commentary surrounding war as well as commentary on economic class and privilege, and so I thought this book had a lot of really good things to say. It wasn't perhaps the most engaging book at times, but it was a very short read. I thought it was very important in terms of the topics it was covering, so I definitely would read more by this author and would definitely reread this again because I do think I would pick up more the second time around. It's a very smart book, and sometimes those really smart books make me feel like I need to read it twice before I pick everything up. I don't know if anyone else ever has that experience with a book. And I also read Time and Time Again by Jack Finney, and this is a time travel story following a man who gets the opportunity to travel through time. This is a book that I wanted to check out because I love the author's other work, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and so I was eager to check out more. I tend to really like time travel stories, and unfortunately I found this one to be just okay. I like with this author that they tend to make those stories feel kind of cute and quaint, which again maybe is more a sign of the time of when this was written, but yeah, I thought it was kind of cozy and sweet and easy to read, but it was very long, and I think it would have worked better perhaps as a novella or a shorter novel, and I liked it to a degree, but again it wasn't very memorable. It wasn't something I see myself thinking about a lot, and yeah, I was kind of underwhelmed. I was hoping I would love it, and yeah, I thought it was fine. And I also want to mention Where We Go When All We Were Is Gone, which is a short story speculative fiction that crosses the line between science fiction and fantasy. This is a short story collection by one of my new favorite authors, or at least the author that wrote How High We Go in the Dark, which is a science fiction book that I love this year. And so while I don't read a lot of short fiction when it comes to SFF or horror these days, this one really got me excited, and I'm glad I read it. It was so weird, it was so trippy, and it definitely leaned into a lot of the themes that I liked so much in How High We Go in the Dark, because it definitely leans into parent stories. It's very emotional once again. The author also brings in Japanese cultural elements to the story, and I loved it so much. I was just hooked in. I binged through the whole thing, and it was nearly perfect except for that one part with the placenta that made me want to throw up, and I did have to skim read those pages because I was physically getting sick. But that's just a personal issue of mine. Besides that, the rest of the book is pretty much perfection. I loved it a lot. Highly recommend it if you are open to reading short stories, even if you don't read them typically like me. This is one you might want to check out if you loved How High We Go in the Dark. Now let's get into some fantasy, talking about some review copies. First off, I've received a copy of Legends and Lattes by Baldree. This is a book that I already talked about in my holiday gift guide, so I'll keep it pretty short here. Basically, we follow an orc who decides to quit their life of fighting and instead open up a coffee shop. This one is just like super cute. It is really just low stakes, adorable. I wish it had more of an emphasis on the coffee aspects because I am a coffee junkie myself, but instead it's just like a feel-good story and definitely just like a nice break from the like epic dark fantasy that I normally read, so I did think it was a lot of fun. I do recommend it if that sounds up your alley. And next up is Flames of Mira by Harmon. This is a book that I received for review from Rebellion. And in this story, we follow a group of people who get their powers from binding themselves to different elements. However, the process to do this is very dangerous. I thought the setup sounded really intriguing. I love a really dark book with some great consequences to the magic system. But beyond that, I found the book to be very tropey or just very predictable, and just the story, the characters, the plot, the world building, everything was fine but not particularly memorable. So I was let down by this book. I thought it was going to be like super gritty with some really good character development. I think this book could have worked really well, but I didn't have much of an impression when I read this book. It just really didn't stick with me, and so I didn't love it as much as I wanted to. Next up is a trilogy that took me most of this time to read, and that is the series that is Under the Northern Sky. The first book is The Wolf by Leo Carew. The second book is The Spider, and the third book, which just came out, is The Cuckoo. And if you're going to start, you do want to start back at the beginning. So this is a piece of historical fantasy that is roughly loosely based around the Viking people of old. And so within the story, we follow individuals as they are trying to vie for power to survive. And I will say that this is a series that I had very mixed feelings when I'm reading it, because in terms of the objective elements, or at least as objective as it can be, I thought the prose were very well done. It's very detailed, it's very nuanced. The characters are complex, they're not black and white, they are very morally gray at times, they have intricate relationships. Like in terms of like the depth of this book on a critical level, I did think it was very accomplished, but I'm not sure I enjoyed reading this series as much as I would have liked to. It is very large in scope, it's very detailed, and I just didn't connect as much as I would like. I've said before, and I'm learning that while I love the idea of historical fantasy, it's not necessarily my top favorite genre within fantasy. So I do think that those of you that love historical fiction on its own, that love this time period, that are just fascinated by Viking stories, will connect with this one more. I'll say I struggled the most with the first book, but then as I spent time with the characters as I worked through, I did find myself more attached within The Spider, and then I did find The Cuckoo to be a good conclusion. I am a fast reader, but this one definitely took me a while to get through because it is long, it is detailed, it is dense. You have to pay close attention to everything in order to pick up the nuances of what's happening. I think it's well done. I just don't think it's for me. Next, I read a backlist title on my own, and that was Empire of the Vampire by Kristoff. I read this book after picking up Nevernight, and if you saw my criticisms of Nevernight, you'll know that this book actually worked a lot better for me. So just to remind you, in Nevernight, I found the book, while it was classified as adult, it read much more like young adult in terms of tone and character maturity. This one really resolved those issues. It's definitely a dark and gritty, but in a way that didn't feel like it was trying so hard. Mostly, I appreciate this story. I thought it was well done. I definitely thought that the author has grown since writing that original book, and so I do see a lot more growth in this series. However, I don't know if I'm going to continue on. It's a very long book to get through, and again, it's just the start of something longer, and it's basically following this vampire who is very brooding, and it's just not my style. It's not something I really connect with. I'm kind of hit or miss with vampire fiction to begin with. But to be fair, I was really concerned at first that these vampires would be sparkly, that it would have this like underlying gothic romance that would make my eyes roll, and that wasn't the case. It definitely felt serious. I thought it was a really good take on vampires. It just didn't, again, really click with me. I wasn't really excited to read it. I just kind of went through the process. I thought the character work was good. The story was fine. It's slow burning, but I went along for the ride. But was it memorable? Was it something that's like hanging on me, just like making me think about it after I finish it? Not really. I was kind of glad to be on to the next thing. And next, I read Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. And this is one I was very excited to get into because after reading Babel, I've been interested in reading more dark academia. And perhaps this was a rough one to follow up with Babel because I do think that book is so polished. But within the story, we follow a young woman who is of biracial descent that gets the opportunity to go to an Ivy League university. And she gets to go there because she has these supernatural abilities. She can see ghosts, and so she gets brought into a secret society to use her powers. And within the secret societies, they use their abilities to do terrible things. And so I really like this book in terms of premise because I thought it was a really smart way to take a classic university narrative where terrible things happen to young women and just the atrocities that really happen when young people are left unchecked. However, in terms of the execution, I like the fact that it tried to bring in this fantastical element, but really it read much more like a thriller than a fantasy book. So in a lot of ways, I could have included this in my thriller and horror wrap-ups because I think it's actually going to most appeal to readers that typically read those genres, even though again, there is a supernatural aspect to the story. It just read more like a supernatural thriller than an fantasy book, if you kind of get that nuanced definition that I kind of made up in my mind. This is a story that I've noticed is very controversial online. People seem to love it or hate it, and I'm kind of in that boring medium where I didn't think it was terrible, but I didn't think it was special. I found the characters to be fine. I didn't really get attached to Alex or anyone else in the story. I somewhat cared for what happened to them, but not really. This book has been criticized for being really dark with a lot of terrible content within the story, and that is the case, but maybe I'm just too insensitive to it that I didn't actually think it was as dark as everyone promised or warned me it was going to be. So while terrible things happen, the tone of the story just felt light in terms of the narrative, so I just never really got that dark and foreboding feel that I wanted to from this one. So I would say that the people who gave it 5 stars kind of oversold it for me, and the people who gave it 1 star and said it was terrible might have kind of just complained about things that weren't necessarily problems for me. But I don't know, I thought the pacing was not great, which is what everyone says, and I thought the book was done and there was still like pages and chapters to go. So yeah, the book wasn't great, but I still didn't hate it. And I also read The Magician's Guild by Trudi Canavan. This is the first book in, I believe, a trilogy, and in the story we follow a group of wizards and magicians who are going through and clearing out the unwanted within the city. However, there is a young girl that manages to break through their magical shield and throw a rock at them, and so they realize that she must have magical abilities that are just natural to her and have not been trained, so they go to find out who she is and try to bring her into their guild. This is a story that definitely read to me a bit more like young adult in terms of tone, but I believe it's classified as adult, although that might be more a marker of the time. I thought this book was very predictable and tropey, but I did not mind it. It was very comforting, and again, a slumpy mood, sometimes you seek things out that are a bit familiar, even if you haven't read them before. I thought that the characters were good, but again, they read as a bit young and immature, and there just wasn't the level of development in terms of characters and world building that I'm used to seeing in a lot of the modern books that are coming out. This book isn't even that old. I think it came out in like 2001. Hopefully don't fact check me too hard, but around there, and I definitely think it shows its age. It just doesn't seem to have some of the qualities that I see in modern fantasy that I've been really spoiled by and come to really love. So I like this one. I might return back to this series if I'm in a slumpy mood, but I wasn't amazed by the writing. I wasn't amazed by the character work. I think it's good, but I've read so many books like it that I don't know how special or memorable it will be over the course of time. And last, let's turn it around by talking about The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. And this is a book that is an adult fantasy that I believe could be considered all ages fantasy. I don't think young adult was really a category at that time, so it's adult in the same way you would categorize The Hobbit as adult fantasy. But within the story, we follow the last unicorn as they are believed to be. There are no more unicorns out there. However, they believe that might not be the case, so they go on this epic journey to go and try to find the rest of the unicorns. They meet up with a wizard, they meet up with an older woman, and together they go and try to do this great epic adventure. This is a book that I want to pick up because I've been in love with the movie since I was a young kid. We had the VHS tape and I probably watched it at least once a week. I was obsessed with it, and I'm happy to say that the movie still holds up as an adult, and this was just the perfect thing for me to pick up in a slumpy mood because I think that going back to a familiar story is the best way to go, because this was pretty much guaranteed to be a favorite. In terms of my personal taste when it comes to fantasy, if I didn't have that connection to this book, this might not have worked as well, because this is very classic fantasy with all the poems and songs that I normally do not love in things like Lord of the Rings. But in this case, it definitely hit me on that personal nostalgic note that really brought it up a notch, and I enjoyed the fact that it was a comforting story. It was predictable. Even without having seen the movie, I think I would have known where it was going, but I enjoyed the tropes in this case. I thought it was just very lovely, and again, not dark in the way that my books are normally dark, but there is a dark underlying aspect to the story that you definitely see as well in the movie. So if you haven't seen the movie, highly recommend it. It's one of my all-time favorites. And if you haven't read the book and are open to it, open to a unicorn story that is dark and beautiful and haunting all at the same time, I highly recommend this one. Definitely one of my favorite standalones, and yeah, I just love it so much. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, are there any you're actually planning on checking out for yourself? I appreciate everyone who stuck around to the end, because I realized that this video was a little bit heavier on the misses than I would have liked. Normally I like to balance it with more favorites, but again, I do have a few recommendations here, just not as many as I would like. By the time you're watching this, hopefully I'm on to reading better things, because again, it always takes me a little bit of time to read, film, and edit and post my videos. So you're watching me mid-slump, which is actually mid-December. So if you're watching this, hopefully I'm reading better things so that I can come back in January with some new favorites. My plan is to come back really strong. So if you're new to my channel and want to subscribe, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy. And if you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, share it around online, drop a comment like a unicorn, because the last unicorn was amazing. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Happy holidays, however you celebrate. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.